Welcome to the journey of one of the most unsettling instances from rural Pennsylvania ever documented. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. Residents of Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, started to report disturbing disruptions in the fall of 1961. Originating from what they had come to understand as the House of Thompson. The remote farmstead had been abandoned for more than 3 years. It was located along a deserted section of what was previously Route 219, about 12 miles northeast of the town of Dubois. The Thompson family had owned the property, which included about 40 acres of overgrown pastures and deep woodland, since Cornelius Thompson bought it in 1923 with funds he received from his father's lumber company. The reports were especially unsettling because they were consistent. Night after night, on their way to and from the nearby municipality of Sandy, locals who were passing past the property reported seeing lights flickering through the windows of the ostensibly empty house. These were what witnesses described as roving illumination, as though someone was dragging a lantern from room to room in purposeful, measured patterns, rather than the continuous glow of electric bulbs or the flicker of candles. The county was initially made aware of these occurrences by Mrs. Gladys Peaton, who ran the local shop in Dubois, sheriff at the beginning of October 1961. She had driven past Thompson's home 3 times on her way back from visits to Sandy and her sister, according to her statement, which was preserved at the Clearfield County Records Office until it was moved on microfilm in 1967. She saw the same thing every time, lights passing through the downstairs windows in what seemed to be a methodical search pattern, stopping at each window for precisely the same amount of time before continuing. The Thompsons. Family history, as documented in local church records and county deed records, shows a pattern of seclusion that had characterized the land for many years. Cornelius Thompson had been a recluse who hardly left the house except to get necessities. He was left to raise their 2 older boys, Jasper and Aurelius, alone on the isolated ranch after his wife Millicent passed away during the severe winter of 1934. The sons had inherited their father's secretive personality, although they were both in their 20s when their mother passed away. On their rare visits to Dubois for supplies, neighbors sometimes saw them. Those who came into contact with the Thompson men were struck by their unique speech pattern. The Thompson brothers always spoke in unison, completing each other's sentences with an unsettling precision that suggested either long-practiced coordination or something deeper and more troubling, according to Ezra Whitmore, who ran the Main Street hardware store until his retirement in 1958. When one of the brothers started to ask for materials, the other would finish it, frequently without glancing at his brother or demonstrating any understanding of the change. The peculiarities of the family were reflected in the property itself. Built in the Gothic revival style, which was popular in rural Pennsylvania in the 1880s, the main house was a 2-story building with an unusually high number of windows for a farmhouse of its size. According to 1923 county construction records, Cornelius had expressly asked for more windows to be added during repairs, commissioned soon after the property was acquired. The change necessitated the removal of multiple load-bearing walls and the installation of steel supports, which was a costly project that baffled local contractors. The changes made to the basement were even more unsettling. Invoices discovered among Cornelius's documents following his death in 1958 indicate that he had ordered the excavation of more chambers beneath the original foundation of the house. A team of guys from outside the county came in early spring to complete the work, 1924, and finish their work prior to the harvest in the fall. Even though such an endeavor would have required heavy gear and weeks of constant labor, no locals remembered seeing these workers or their equipment. After Millicent's passing in 1934, the Thompson property's isolation increased. The family started asking for supplies to be left at the end of their long driveway instead of being delivered to the house, according to Dubois delivery drivers. Likewise, mail was gathered from a box that was over a quarter of a mile away from the main structure. Despite making deliveries to the Thompson family's property twice a week for 23 years, Clement Thorpe, a rural mail carrier, recorded in his monthly records that he never saw any members of the Thompson family. Up until the summer of 1958, when Cornelius Thompson's passing caused the first major upheaval to the family's meticulously preserved seclusion, this arrangement went smoothly. Dr. Marcus Kellner, the coroner, was called to the scene by, "This is Jasper Thompson on a hot July morning," based on the report by Dr. Kellner that is kept in the county medical examiner's records. Although the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Cornelius's body generated doubts that were never publicly answered, it appears that Cornelius had died of natural causes. The body was discovered in one of the chambers that had been dug out in the house's basement in 1924. Cornelius occupied an elaborate wooden chair that seems to have been placed purposefully in the middle of the space. His hands were neatly folded in his lap, and he was wearing his nicest attire. The state of the room itself was what Dr. Kellner found odd. The walls were covered in what looked to be intricate designs and maps, all of which had been painstakingly and precisely drawn by hand. The house and property plan was shown in the drawings, but Dr. Kellner was unable to decipher the notations in the language or code. The finding of many journals piled on a table next to the chair. The notebooks, which were loaded with entries going all the way back to 1923, recorded what Cornelius called nocturnal confirmations and evening observations. With sporadic English sentences that alluded to surveillance activities, the entries were written in the same unintelligible code as the wall notations. Throughout the text's accessible sections, there were references to behavioral changes, response times, and monitoring patterns. Aurelius Thompson and Jasper appeared extremely calm during Dr. Kellner's analysis of their father's corpse. They provided information that was technically correct, but emotionally cold, responding to inquiries with the same synchronized speech pattern that the residents of the town had observed for years. When questioned about their father's activities in the basement, they clarified that Cornelius had been spending more time there lately, claiming to be finishing significant research. The isolation of the Thompson family was mirrored in the funeral plans. Cornelius was laid to rest in a site that seems to have been prepared well in advance at a private cemetery on the property. The local newspaper did not publish a death notice, and there was no funeral service. As required by law, Dr. Kellner filed county vital records, which contain the only official record of Cornelius Thompson's passing. Jasper and Aurelius continued the family's solitary way of life even more after their father's funeral. The property's deliveries were more erratic, and the neighbors observed that the boys appeared to have taken up their father's habit of staying in the basement rooms for long periods of time. Once, a dependable sign of the family's existence, smoke from the house's chimney started to exhibit strange patterns, burning non-stop for days at a time and staying cold for weeks at a time. Only a few months after Cornelius's passing in the late spring of 1958, Thompson's home began to show the first signs of a significant transformation. On 3 consecutive occasions, Harold Fairchild, a traveling salesman who frequently passed the farm on his monthly route through Clearfield County, claimed sighting both brothers standing still in the front yard at precisely midnight. In June 1958, Fairchild told Sheriff William Torrance that the brothers seemed to be conducting some sort of surveillance, standing motionless and facing the road as though they were anticipating something. Why was Fairchild's report so noteworthy? His account of the brothers' actions was unnerving. Instead of recognizing his passing car, Jasper and Aurelia stayed perfectly still, their heads following the path of Fairchild's headlights to the exact moment. The brothers' movement was too exact and well coordinated to appear spontaneous, according to Fairchild, who compared the experience to witnessing two pieces of machinery react to a pre-programmed stimulus. Fairchild's probe by Sheriff Torrance report did not provide much more information. The following week, he went to Thompson's house and discovered it to be deserted, with no one answering his knocks at the front door. There were indications that the residence had been occupied recently. There were fresh tire tracks in the driveway and laundry hanging on lines, but the brothers themselves were nowhere to be found. In his assessment, Torrance observed that the area surrounding the property was remarkably quiet, devoid of any typical country sounds. No bug activity, no bird singing, no tiny animals rustling in the undergrowth. Several witnesses reported similar sightings over the summer of 1958, continuing the trend of midnight visits. Living on a nearby farm about 2 miles south of Thompson's home, Emma Caldwell started recording these visits in a diary, which she eventually turned in to the county government. Her diaries detailed nocturnal vigils during which she would position herself, and they were written in exact handwriting that matched her experience as a former schoolteacher. Herself watching the Thompson property from the window of her bedroom. The brothers continued their nightly monitoring routine with clockwork regularity, according to Caldwell's notebook. At precisely 11:58 p.m. every night, lights would appear in the downstairs windows of the house. Jasper and Aurelius would come out of the front door and take their places in the yard at exactly midnight. They would go back to the house after standing still for precisely 17 minutes. The lights would go out at 12:20 a.m., and it would be dark on the land till the next night. The brothers' evident awareness of being watched worried Caldwell the most. During her vigil, she observed that on multiple occasions, one or both of them would shift their focus to her home and gaze straight at her window, even though it was dark and far away, making her presence invisible. After precisely 30 seconds of apparent awareness, the brothers would shift their focus back to their road surveillance. The unsettling actions at Thompson's home became more intense in the fall of 1958. Late at night, residents of Sandy, which is adjacent, started to complain that they could hear heavy machinery coming from the property. Even though no construction equipment had been seen coming into or going out of the region, the noises, which were compared to excavation or demolition activity, would start at around 2 in the morning and end abruptly at dawn, with the first rays of dawn. A number of farms in the region were part of Dr. Kellner's medical practice, and he started getting reports from farmers about strange animal behavior that appeared to correspond with Thompson's house's evening activity. Around midnight, livestock would start to get restless and wouldn't settle until long after daybreak. At precisely 2 a.m., when the mechanical noises started, dogs all across the place would start howling simultaneously. The reports of wildlife abandonment were the most alarming. Deer. The land around Thompson's house was completely devoid of rabbits and other small creatures that were once prevalent there. When Caldwell's nightly observations showed a notable shift in the brothers' routine in December 1958, the situation approached a breaking point. Jasper and Aurelia started extending their monitoring durations, often staying in the yard until almost daybreak, in place of their customary 17-minute watch. Throughout these prolonged sessions, Caldwell claimed to have seen more figures wandering around the property, but she was never able to figure out who they were or how they got there undetected. Caldwell's assessment that the boys had started to physically transform was more concerning. She observed through her binoculars that both guys seemed to be rapidly losing weight, their clothing drooping carelessly on ever thinner bodies. Their movements, which had previously been marked by disturbing coordination, became more stilted and mechanical. The most unsettling thing she noticed was that, with every week that went by, It appeared as though the twins' facial characteristics were getting more identical. The Thompson family had a long history of solitude. Thus, the disappearance of Jasper and Aurelius Thompson was not immediately noted. Local officials didn't realize something could be amiss until spring deliveries started piling up at the end of their driveway. When Sheriff Torrance conducted a welfare check in April 1959, the residence appeared to be deserted, with number, indications of the brothers' presence other than personal items that were left undisturbed in their bedrooms. Torrance's exploration of the underground chambers that Dr. Kellner had described after Cornelius's death was the most important discovery. Since the coroner's visit, the rooms underneath the house had undergone significant alteration, with additional excavation significantly expanding the subterranean area. Thousands of intricate drawings and notes now covered the walls, forming a sophisticated visual record that defied interpretation. There was a space in the middle of these basement rooms that seemed to have been used as an observation center of some kind. Numerous chairs faced a wall covered with charts, maps, and what looked like surveillance schedules in a precise pattern. In addition to the Thompson property, the maps showed the neighborhood for miles in all directions, paying particular attention to the locations of other homes and the routines of their occupants. The documents discovered were the most unsettling, dispersed among the rooms of the basement. Every family within 5 miles of Thompson's home had their daily routines documented in thousands of pages of handwritten notes. Arrival and departure times, behavioral patterns, and what seemed to be forecasts of future actions were all noted in the scientifically accurate data. These texts all have the same handwriting, indicating that either one person created the full amount of content or several people developed. The writing styles are strikingly similar. About a month before Sheriff Torrance found the empty house, on March 15, 1959, the last entry in these observation logs was made. The entry, which was lengthier and more thorough than usual, explained what the author referred to as integration protocol preparation. Referring to the phases of implementation, behavioral modeling, and subject selection, the language used was clinical and technical. The primary observation period was noted at the end of the entry. Successfully enter the permitted active phase. The lack of conclusive evidence of foul play hindered Sheriff Torrance's inquiry. Clothing, personal goods, and what looked to be substantial sums of money were among the brothers' personal stuff that were still in their rooms. There were no indications of violence or struggle elsewhere on the site. The most perplexing thing was that the brothers' car was still parked where it usually is, so it was unclear how they may have departed from the property. The testimony of locals who gave contradictory descriptions of the brothers' last weeks further muddied the case. In March 1959, a number of witnesses claimed to have seen Jasper and Aurelius in town, buying supplies as usual and acting in a synchronized manner. It was impossible to determine a precise time frame for the brothers' disappearance, though, because other locals asserted that they had not been spotted in public since the previous autumn. The most thorough description of the brothers' last weeks can be found in Emma Caldwell's early 1959 diary entries. She had noticed that the nocturnal surveillance routine had become much more intricate and unsettling. The brothers had started to move around the neighborhood under cover of darkness, visiting nearby properties and seemingly doing in-depth inspections of homes and barns, rather than just standing in their yard. Caldwell's entries depict her mounting anxiety as that the brothers were methodically examining every facet of her neighbors' lives. She recorded times when the brothers would stand outside homes for hours, seemingly timing the occupants' activities and recording their observations. The thing that scared her the most was seeing that the brothers had started to imitate the actions they saw, mimicking their neighbors' routines and mannerisms with unsettling precision. Caldwell's diary's last entry, made on March 20, 1959, details an encounter that persuaded her to call the authorities and stop her nightly surveillance. That night, she saw both of her brothers standing right under her bedroom window, staring up at her with what she described as expectant looks. They stayed where they were, staring at the place where she had been standing, even after she moved away from the window. They kept this watch until daybreak, never shifting or recognizing her when she came back for a moment to see where they were. In October 1959, the Thompson brothers' disappearance was formally concluded as a case of voluntary adult departure without any indication of criminal conduct. Sheriff Torrance had ongoing misgivings about the case's circumstances nonetheless, as evidenced by his secret notes found among his documents when he retired in 1963. According to Torrance's own views, the brothers' departure may have been the result of a planned strategy, rather than an impetuous departure. For almost 2 years after the brothers' disappearance, Thompson's empty home remained untouched. The property entered a complicated legal limbo that hindered its sale or renovation, despite the fact that it had no obvious legal errors and no mortgage or tax lines. Before ownership could be formally transferred, the house and property would probably stay in legal limbo for years, if not decades, according to local real estate lawyers. Reports of strange activities during this time and, in earnest, Thompson's house started. Mrs. Peaton's initial report of the lights passing through the windows in October 1961 was just the start of a string of progressively unsettling observations that would persist for years. In contrast to the Thompson brothers' planned monitoring, these new activities seemed haphazard and aimless, as though a stranger was investigating the house's rooms and hallways. The first person to report the brothers' nightly vigils was Harold Fairchild, a traveling salesman. During his regular visits to the region, he started recording the new phenomenon. His thorough logs, which he turned in to the county authorities in November 1961, showed that there seemed to be no pattern to the lights. They would occasionally travel quickly from room to room. At times, they would stand still for hours at a time. The most perplexing finding was that the lights would sometimes show up in apartments without windows facing the street, indicating that the lighting was either leaking through inner walls or that there were more windows. When several witnesses claimed to have seen individuals roaming about the property during the day, the story became even more complicated. These individuals were blurry and hard to focus on, unlike the brothers who had been immediately identifiable even from a distance. When witnesses tried to see these figures up close, they reported seeing an odd visual phenomena. The figures appeared to dissolve or becoming transparent the more they focused on seeing clearly. Marcus Kellner, a physician his medical training allowed him to address strange occurrences scientifically, and he started looking into the stories on his own. As part of his research, he positioned himself at numerous points of view throughout the Thompson property and conducted methodical observations in a variety of weather and daylight circumstances. His personal diary, which he eventually donated to the County Historical Society, documented his observations, which showed trends that were difficult to explain. Based on Kellner's findings, the numbers looked to be involved in activities that resembled typical human behavior in the area surrounding Thompson's home, but with minor variations that produced an unnerving impact. On closer inspection, they would be only going through the motions without really doing any duties, even though they would appear to be working in the yard. They would follow pathways, but their motions were too repetitive and regular to be considered organic. Kellner's finding that these figures appeared to be acting like people rather than truly taking part in it. Researchers from outside Clearfield County became interested in Thompson's extraordinary actions during the winter of 1961-1962. Dr. Kellner's correspondence with academic colleagues informed Dr. Helena Voss, a University of Pennsylvania psychologist who specialized in social dynamics and group behavior, about the situation. The purpose of Dr. Voss's first visit to the region in January 1962 was to do a quick fact-finding mission, but she was persuaded to start a more thorough investigation by the things she saw. Recruiting local volunteers to act as systematic observers and giving them standardized reporting forms and observation schedules was part of Dr. Voss's research technique. Making a thorough log of everything that happened in Thompson's house so that it could be examined for trends and possible causes was the aim. The volunteers who had been witnessing the events were mostly from Dubois and Sandy, embraced the chance to participate in a scientific study informally. The information gathered for Dr. Voss's research showed unsettling trends that previous casual observations had overlooked. There seemed to be a sophisticated kind of behavioral mirroring going on among the characters surrounding Thompson's home, not merely replicating human actions, but researching and refining them by practice. The same exercises would be performed repeatedly by various figures, who would progressively get better at them until their movements started to resemble typical human behavior. The fact that these persons were specifically researching the habits of locals was even more concerning. In some cases, the figures would engage in behaviors specific to local people, as reported by Dr. Voss's team. Dr. Kellner's habit of adjusting his glasses while conducting observations, Harold Fairchild's unique walking gait, or Emma Caldwell's particular method of hanging laundry. The precision of these imitations were so accurate they could only have been the result of extensive, in-depth observation. Dr. Voss's discovery of the link between the figure's actions and the copious surveillance records uncovered in Thompson's basement marked a breakthrough in knowledge. An exact link was found when the figure's behavioral tendencies were compared to the Thompson brothers' meticulous observations. The figures were not imitating human behavior at random. They were methodically going over the behavioral profiles that Aurelius and Jasper had so painstakingly recorded. Dr. Voss came to a startling conclusion on the nature of the phenomena at Thompson's house as a result of this realization. According to the evidence, the Thompson brothers had not just vanished. Rather, they had been replaced by creatures that were practicing human behavior using their acquired knowledge. The monitoring logs were being used as a teaching guide, offering comprehensive guidelines on how to mimic the customs and behaviors of the local populace. This discovery's ramifications led Dr. Voss to broaden her investigation in an effort to comprehend not just what was going on inside Thompson's residence, but also why such a complex deception was being undertaken. Her examination into the property's past turned up more unsettling information that had been missed by previous studies. The Thompson property had changed hands, according to county land records, extremely frequently in the late 1800s, when the previous owners regularly moved to far-off places and sold rapidly. Other irregularities were discovered in the period's church documents. It was reported that several families who had been on the land had abruptly left, frequently in the middle of the night and without leaving forwarding addresses. The repeated, inexplicable departures caused parish priests to express alarm, but no formal investigation was ever carried out. According to the pattern, whatever was. The events that took place at Thompson's home in the 1960s had decades-old historical precursors. When Dr. Voss and her research helper, graduate student Robert Chen, vanished during a scheduled overnight observation visit at Thompson's home in March 1962, the investigation came to an abrupt end. They vanished under circumstances strikingly similar to those of the Thompson brothers. There were no indications of a struggle, personal items were not disturbed, and the car was still at the study site. Website. State police and volunteer search teams from neighboring counties participated in the hunt for Dr. Voss and her aide. The thorough examination of Thompson's home and the surrounding area showed that the missing researchers had been there, but it offered no information regarding their whereabouts. The most perplexing finding was that Dr. Voss's study papers had been methodically arranged and stored in the subterranean rooms, as though someone had thoroughly examined and catalogued her. Conclusions. The two instances had a lot in common, according to Sheriff William Torrance, who had looked into the Thompson brothers' initial disappearance. In all cases, there was no trace of violence or conflict, and the disappearances included people who had been researching or watching activities at Thompson's home. Torrance suggested that the house be condemned and dismantled because he believed it might be somehow accountable for these incidents. But the law, the ownership of the property, was complicated, making any quick action impossible. County officials decided they had no right to take or damage private property unless there was unmistakable proof of criminal activity. Reports of strange activity kept piling up in the sheriff's department files, but the house remained unoccupied and empty. The occurrences at Thompson's residence underwent a dramatic shift in the years after Dr. Voss vanished. The sporadic lights and more structured and intentional activity took the place of the previously reported hazy figures. Witnesses started reporting what seemed to be typical human occupants of the residence. People who were visible through windows were doing common household tasks, including cleaning, cooking, and reading. These views were unsettling because it was realized that the purported residence bore striking resemblance to local missing people. The return of Emma Caldwell to her nightly. Despite the risks, some claimed seeing figures that looked like Dr. Voss, the Thompson brothers, and other people who had vanished from the area in earlier decades. As though they were truly at home, these figures strolled through the house with ease, but their actions had the same routine feel that had defined the outdoor phenomenon. Harold Fairchild regularly had the chance to observe the apparent residents of the area through his monthly visits. Thompson's residence. His meticulous 1962 and 1963 diaries show that the number of individuals that could be seen through the windows of the house gradually increased, and that their apparent humanity also improved. Movements were noted as stiff and awkward in early observations. However, subsequent investigations saw conduct that became more and more similar to typical human behavior. The most unsettling change occurred in late 1963 when people in Dubois and Sandy started to report seeing, who said they were members of the Thompson family visiting the area again. These interactions usually took place in town during business hours, with the people showing up at nearby stores and services to carry out regular business. There was an unnerving sensation of recognition, without a distinct recall, as store owners and service providers observed that these alleged Thompson relatives appeared familiar, but were unable to locate them. The Thompson family had been supplied by Ezra Whitmore's hardware store for many years. He talked of his bewilderment during a number of these interactions. People who claimed to be distant Thompson cousins would come to his store with precise knowledge of past transactions and family history, but there was something off about the way they looked and behaved. Whitmore observed that rather than actually being linked to the Thompson family, these guests appeared to be acting as members of the family. When county records showed that multiple people claiming to be Thompson were involved, the matter became more complicated. Legal documents had been filed by heirs claiming the property. These claimants presented thorough family histories and seemingly authentic legal papers. However, inquiries turned up discrepancies that pointed to intentional dishonesty. The finding that some of these claimants resembled people who had vanished from the area in the past was the most concerning. The last examination of Thompson's home by Sheriff Torrance, who was getting ready to retire in late. It was discovered in 1963 that the underground chambers had undergone significant alteration. Once more, the observation center Dr. Kellner had found after Cornelius Thompson's death had been developed into a sophisticated system of passageways and rooms that went well beyond the house's original foundation. Thousands more documents, photos, and in-depth behavioral studies were stacked on the walls of these rooms. The most important was Torrance's finding of what seemed to have an extensive database of missing people from all throughout the area. Photographs, behavioral analyses, and comprehensive biographical data were arranged scientifically. In addition to Dr. Voss and the Thompson brothers, the collection contained scores of additional people who had vanished from the region over a number of decades. Evidence of thorough research and monitoring was found in every file, indicating that the disappearances had been meticulously planned and carried out. What Torrance referred to in his report as implementation protocols, specific guidelines for adopting the identities of the preserved people, were included in the archive's last part. These materials provide detailed instructions for reproducing speech patterns, body language, social relationships, and personal histories. The clinical precision with which the protocols were written suggests that identity assumption was being carried out as a methodical procedure as opposed to haphazard impersonation. The actions of Sheriff Torrance, Thompson's departure in January 1964, essentially put a stop to the official inquiry into his home, since Sheriff James Morrison, who took over a department with few resources and urgent issues in other parts of the county. Morrison's strategy in the Thompson case was to keep simple records of reports and refrain from conducting an active investigation. This approach persisted for a number of years. The events in Thompson's home continued to develop throughout this time of official inaction in ways that recommended improving organization and sophistication. The people posing as Thompson family members were more effective in assimilating into the community, forming bonds and commercial ties that eventually made their presence seem ordinary and unremarkable. Initially perplexed by these people, store owners and service providers eventually grew acclimated to their presence. Now, in her 70s and growing weaker, Emma Caldwell carried on documenting events that took place at Thompson's home till her passing in 1965. Her last journal entries, found by family members among her belongings, reveal her increasing anxiety that the creatures at Thompson's home had succeeded in their apparent impersonation mission. 2 weeks before her death, she wrote in her final journal that she thought some of the people in town were not who they said they were, but that she no longer felt able to tell the difference between clever imposters and real locals. What happened to Emma Caldwell marked the conclusion of systematic civilian observation of Thompson's home because no other occupants were able or willing to continue the thorough monitoring she had been doing for almost 7 years. In the absence of her paperwork, official records of odd activity at the site were few and inconsistent, mostly consisting of sporadic complaints from deliverymen and passing drivers. Evidence, however, indicates that Thompson's actions persisted and may have even increased during this time of decreased. Observation. Midway through the 1960s, county vital records reveal an odd trend of newcomers to the area, frequently claiming kinship ties to older inhabitants who had either moved away or passed away. In order to successfully assimilate into the society, these newcomers usually had in-depth knowledge of local history and customs. One of the most reliable observers of the Thompson phenomena, due to his scientific training, was Dr. Marcus Kellner, who started recording what he called social infiltration patterns within his own notes from 1965 and 1966. According to his observations, entities were spreading throughout the area rather than staying centered at the original property, indicating that the effective impersonation techniques developed at Thompson's house were being used on a larger scale. According to Kellner's notes, he became increasingly concerned that the phenomenon had progressed from isolated anomalous activity to something that affected the entire community. His medical career gave him access to deep familiarity with local households. Additionally, he started observing subtle changes in long-term patients that suggested they might not be who they seemed to be. He was persuaded that successful identity replacement had become commonplace by changes in medical history, physical characteristics, and behavioral patterns. written just before his own abrupt departure from the area in late 1966, the last entry in Dr. Kellner's note states his conviction that the entities at Thompson's house had accomplished total accomplishment of their ostensible goal. He came to the conclusion that the region's initial human population had been methodically examined, supplanted, and assimilated by beings whose ultimate function was yet unknown. Although Kellner's unexpected departure and lack of a forwarding address were noted by co-workers, his declared reason for leaving was retirement. When the property was eventually sold to new owners in 1967, the Thompson case was officially closed in county records and the original house, and constructed a contemporary residential building. Any tangible proof of the earlier events was removed by the new structure, and the basement chambers that had been the focal point of the enigmatic activities were filled in and sealed. Officials from the county were pleased that the long-standing concerns over odd activity in the region had been allayed by the demolition of Thompson's home. But locals with vivid memories pointed out that the Thompson case's outcome fell within a time frame of huge increase in Clearfield County's population. Regularly, new families moved in, frequently claiming ties to longtime locals, and exhibiting an extraordinary level of acquaintance with the history and practices of the area. There was a widespread feeling that the region was growing and developing in a positive way, since the newcomers blended in with the community so well that their presence seemed normal and ordinary. This integration was so successful that by the end of the 1960s, only few residents recalled or talked about the strange actions that had been focused on Thompson's home. During a rearrangement of county records, the official files that documented years of unusual phenomena were moved to storage and ultimately lost. As the importance of the paper was lost, the in-depth observations made by Emma Caldwell, Dr. Kellner, and other witnesses were either thrown away or dispersed among private collections. Clears throat. Today, there is just a little historical plaque indicating the location of Thompson's home, the property's contribution to the early growth of the county, the countless disappearances and unexplained events that plagued the area for almost 10 years, as well as the mystery activities that took place there, are not mentioned on the plaque. Only a quiet, residential neighborhood with well-kept homes and amiable locals who exhibit an exceptional understanding of the history and customs of the area are visible to visitors. In recent years, the few researchers who have tried to look into the Thompson case have discovered, because tangible evidence has been removed due to the property's redevelopment, witness testimony is inaccessible, and official documents are lacking. As a collection of unconnected missing person cases and unverified reports of odd activity, the investigation is still formally closed. The numerous disappearances have never been linked, and there is no proof to back up allegations of social infiltration or systematic identity substitution. However, there are still questions for those who are prepared to inquire. The phenomenon may have produced results far beyond what was recorded in official investigations, as evidenced by the remarkable success with which new residents assimilated into the community during the 1960s, the unusual completeness with which official records were lost or destroyed, and the peculiar reluctance of longtime residents to discuss the Thompson case. A family with multi-generational links to the area currently resides in the house on the Thompson property, full of thorough family histories and in-depth familiarity with regional traditions. The family members are indistinguishable from other long-term residents, well-liked in the neighborhood, and involved in local groups. When queried about the history of the property, they politely show bewilderment, stating that they had heard hazy tales about past owners, but have never encountered anything out of the ordinary while living there. The fact that the present occupants of the former Thompson residence are perhaps the most telling. Property has the same exceptional speech and movement coordination that observers have previously observed in Aurelius, Thompson, and Jasper. They move in unconscious synchronicity, complete each other's sentences with startling accuracy, and have an understanding of each other's intentions and ideas that transcends typical familial closeness. However, neighbors no longer view these behaviors as unsettling abnormalities, but rather as endearing family characteristics. Thompson's house's makeover. Perhaps the greatest achievement of whatever forces were at play there in the 1960s is the transformation from a source of mystery and terror into a symbol of communal stability and growth. The beings that formerly rehearsed human behavior in secret underground rooms are now able to live freely as recognized members of society because the phenomenon has been fully integrated into everyday community life, negating the need for concealment or subterfuge. The Thompson's house case reminds us that the most prosperous infiltrations might grow so comprehensive that they are no longer identifiable as such, when the replacement is identical to the original, when the practice surpasses the natural in authenticity. The mission is considered a complete success when the observers are the observed. Once moving enigmatically through empty windows, the lights now glow warmly from residences that are filled, and the people who used to act like people in dark yards are now well-respected neighbors and civic leaders. Moreover, maybe in the end, that was always the